Hi, folks. I just want to take a few minutes today to talk to you about your final project for SOS 212 Systems Dynamics and Sustainability. This will be a project that gives you an opportunity to take all of the things that you learned this semester and apply them to modeling a system that you come up with on your own from the real world. Now, you won't have to do this all on your own. This is a group project. And so you'll come together usually with team members of 3 or 4, but your instructor, maybe me, will end up telling you that based on how many people are in your class that semester. But then with your group, you'll use system dynamics modeling, again, what we've been learning about this whole semester, to model a real world process. And it would be great if this were sustainability related. That's not a hard requirement, but of course, that is highly desirable. I want to make sure you don't pick one of the examples we've already gone over in the class or read through in the book, but I will give you the opportunity to embellish one of those significantly. So let's say, we do a lot in this class on fisheries. And so you might be interested in doing a fisheries model. Now, you can't do a simple fisheries model that was in the book, but you potentially could start with one of those and then build on top of it some additional systems which create additional complexities that make it worthwhile to model that. So it is possible to grow one of the models we've seen before, but I really want you to, whenever possible, to sort of think about from the ground up, what's a system we haven't explicitly modeled in class that you might like to model on your own? So what might that look like? Well, here's a couple of ideas that I've listed here. So these could be things that are a little more abstract, like how ideas spread in a group of people. So we will, in this class, talk about the BAS model of innovation diffusion, which is sort of like how a new innovation spreads through a market, kind of in a kind of disease-like way. And you could probably embellish that sort of idea and think about, well, how do other sorts of ideas spread through people, like recycling and so on? What are the challenges of people choosing to recycle, how that becoming a norm? What are the opportunities for that? What are the advantages? Those sorts of things. If you'd like to be a little more physical, you could actually model a physical resource moving around, like the dynamics of water in reservoirs across the Phoenix area. You could keep track of how much water is in different reservoirs, and those might be your kind of stock variables. And you could keep track of, based on different usage patterns at different times of the year, then you might watch those go up and down, and then maybe challenge your model with different what if scenarios. If we have a really bad drought, if there's a really hot summer where people use a lot of power, and then you could sort of think about, well, how does power generation relate to water conservation, and so on and so forth, and model that in your model. Electricity consumption regeneration or in generation, that is another one, kind of relates to what I was just saying there. You can model how much electricity is being used in the city, how much is being generated, what happens to generation policies as demands and supply get sort of farther apart from each other. You can come up with a lot of different things related to electricity consumption. Then you could get into even more complex kind of interactions between the social and the physical. So you could imagine, like, well, population growth. Well, that is sort of an easy to quantify thing in a city. And so that would be something you could model, like we've seen modeled, but you could then add on top of it like a social justice component. So could you model the effects of population growth on social justice? And so that might be able to sort of allow you to play with these what if scenarios, where if maybe you're in a certain situation at one population size, as the city grows, then will the social justice situation and context change just as a factor of growth? So it's sort of what are the endogenous drivers of changes in social justice? Energy, that sort of thing, climate change, et cetera. So all of these things are things that you could investigate within something like a city. And each one of these things by itself is an interesting model. And then when you add the additional complexity of seeing how population modulates those things, then that adds a lot of cool stuff to it too. Other systems that you might think about, again, just throwing out ideas there, are nutrient cycling dynamics. So a lot of you who, if you've taken courses in ecology, are familiar with all of these different cycles out there, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, et cetera. And so, these would be easy things to think about simulating. You go back into your textbooks about these things and simulate, well, what happens when certain processes, when animals die, how does that affect the nutrient chemistry of the earth? And then what are the timescales of the things that happen to those things as they get processed in the soil? And then what happens to them as they go into the plants, and how do they get back into the animals? And so that in itself becomes a cycle, from animal to soil to plant back to animal. But then you can add a human component to that. As humans decide what to plant, when to harvest. Humans decide which animals get access to which plants, and so on and so forth. And so you then create, there's this interesting coupled natural human system that you can play with there. I have a colleague who did some really interesting work in Mongolia, where she showed that locusts were swarming because farmers were bringing their goats in at night, and the goats would defecate in their barns, and then the farmers would collect their waste and then would use it for fuel. Now, because they're collecting their waste and using it for fuel, that waste that would have gone back into the soil was not, and it was depleting the soil of important nutrients. And it turns out that when locusts, which can develop either into solitary forms or swarm, these gregarious forms, these plague locust forms, that they're more likely to develop into the plague kind when this particular nutrient is taken out of their diet. And so by telling the farmers that they need to go back to spreading the goat waste onto their fields, it actually provided a way to get rid of the locust swarms. So that is something that would be a great thing that you could model. So these are just some examples of things you can model all over the board. But the big thing is I want you to use a system dynamics model, and I want it to be sort of complex enough that you will be answering a question that would be difficult to answer without the model. So I don't want you to just be demonstrating something that we kind of knew already, is going to happen. If you could say, well, if I set the thermostat's temperature higher, it's going to get hotter in the room. Well, I didn't really need a model for that. I kind of knew that that was going to happen. But if you add these other complexities, if I, change these different ways I insulate the house, if I change patterns of energy use, if I change how often this thing happens, all of these sorts of things, as they add in, these complex systems become hard to predict with our mental models. And that's why we need a computational model. So I don't want you to push yourself to be overly ambitious, but I do want you to come up with a model that helps you answer a question that doesn't have an obvious answer that ahead of time. And I'm happy to help you with that as we move forward. So how is this going to be organized? Well, there are a number of assignments which go into this, which are trickled in throughout the rest of the semester. So these assignments all add up to 25% of your final grade for the course. Precise due dates and more detailed instructions can be found on Canvas for each one of these. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what's kind of expected at these different points throughout the rest of the semester. So the first thing you have to worry about is forming that team, forming your team. So choosing people to be in your team. And again, this normally will be about 3 or 4 team members, but for your particular class, your instructor or me might change that depending on how many people are in your class. After lecture E1, the Saturday after lecture E1, you are going to submit to a Canvas assignment the names of those who are in your group. It's a very simple assignment. You submit it, everyone in the group submits it. That way, when we grade these things, we can make sure that everyone in the group agrees who's in their group. And that's 1% of your grade, done, without really much to do with it. So everyone does that. Now, you might find that in this process that you are really excited about some system and another group is really excited about some system, but you can't work together because it would make too big of a group. What you can do is I'd like you to work on separate aspects. Like I don't want you to be working on exactly the same thing, but I'm not against groups working together on sharing results and maybe even coming up with super sort of complex systems with one group kind of handling one module or one sector or set of sectors and the other group handling another set of sectors. In the end, each one of you need to submit your own independent submission. It can't depend on the other group's model or the other group's analysis. But while you're working, I'm totally happy that while you're working, you can work with each other in sort of trying to understand each other's problems and things like that, and help collaborate with each other. But I want to make sure that groups are working on different models. So you submit, definitely a different model. But those models can overlap in this kind of the types of systems that you're modeling. So maybe you're both modeling how cities scale with population, but you're more focused on electricity and they're more focused on water. And maybe there is some overlap in how you can discuss, how these things might, interact with each other, but one of you will submit a water model and the other one will submit an electricity model. After you submit that, then your instructor will then form formal Canvas groups, and most of the rest of the next assignments will be group assignments. So the first group assignment is going to be a proposal assignment, and it's due the Sunday after lecture E3, which is about a week and a half after you submit your team name, or the names of members in your team. In the project proposal, it is 1 or 2 pages. It's concise, so it can be short. See Canvas for more details. This is a good chunk of your the grade here. And this is going to identify the system that you're studying, the research question, so hopefully a how or a why question that is motivating you to do this research. You are going to identify the parameters that you'll use in your model, likely state variables that you'll use in the model, and likely output variables that you'll measure from your model that allow you to assess the performance of your model and the validity of your model relative to the real system. Along with those, I'd like to see a causal loop diagram showing me the relationships between the parameters, state variables, and output variables that you've identified. Now, I know that by this point, you won't have thought of your entire model, and I'm not expecting you to, but I want you to identify key parameters, state variables, and output variables that kind of show me that you've put some real thought into the problem. Once you end up doing the real model, there's probably going to be a lot more state variables, output variables, and parameters. And maybe some of the ones you thought you needed here, you'll end up getting rid of or replacing with others. And that's fine. But I just need sort of a core list of parameters, state variables, and output variables, and a causal loop diagram showing me how you think they might relate to each other. I'm not looking for a stock and flow diagram. I'm not looking for a simulation output or anything. I'm just looking for you showing me the relationships that you think are likely there and that are going to be important for you to model when you build that stock and flow diagram. All right. So then I'll leave you alone for another week or week and a half or something like that. It might be, as much as 2 weeks. And then we'll have an in-class period, and this will be the class after lecture F1. And so this will be a period in class where we will spend the whole class doing a stock and flow model check-in. So what that basically means is that you will work with your group during that class to make sure that you have, by the end of the class, a working stock and flow model that shows that you're making basic progress on the quantitative modeling part of the assignment. So I'm not expecting the full model that you'll end up using in the full project, but I am expecting you to at least show me some subset that you've assembled, a couple of stocks, a couple of flows, some variables linked together that actually is executable and has results that kind of pass face validity, that they kind of make sense on the face of them, that they kind of are doing the things you'd expect them to do that the real system would do. Now, by the end of that class period, then the instructor or a TA will end up giving you a check mark to say, you've confirmed to me that your model is working and you're moving in the right direction, and we're safe with you'll be safe moving on your own. If by the end of the class period you can't do that, then by that weekend, basically, then you'll end up being able to create a video presentation where you'll do a demonstration and upload it to Canvas. And then that way we can review that online instead. So preferably you do it during the class period, and we can give you some help if you're having some trouble getting that moving along. But then if you end up not being able to complete that by the end of the class period, then the weekend after that, you'll end up having to upload a video showing your working demo, just to demonstrate to us that you're moving in the right direction and you've got a simulation that's actually operational. Not your full simulation, but a small subset of your simulation that is operational. All right. And then the last kind of big things are at the end of the project. And so the last week of the regular schedule, you're going to submit a project report midweek. This project report is going to be, again, a major chunk of your grade. It's only going to be 4 pages, excluding a title page, references, and an appendix. So if you need more to embellish on certain things, there's room for that in the appendix, but keep in mind that the only thing we'll be grading is in those 4 pages. So the appendix is kind of like just in case the reader needs a little bit of extra detail, it's in the appendix, but everything that you'll be graded on will be in the main 4 pages. And those will have a particular structure, which is detailed in a document online, but is also listed here. So basically, you're going to have an executive summary, which is going to be an abstract of the whole report. This is meant to stand alone, this executive summary. This is meant to be for an executive who has no intent of reading your entire report, will just read this paragraph, this executive summary, and they'll be able to know what your system was, what question you asked, that you used simulation to try to answer that question, what you basically found, you summarize your results, and what conclusions you drew from those results. So that's like 5 things that they get out of that, which are a summary of all of the report, and it's all crammed into 1 paragraph. So that paragraph stands alone. It is not an introduction. It is really meant to stand alone, as to be a summary of the whole report. And then the kind of intro sort of thing follows that, where you do your problem description and research question. You're going to then just define in another section. Remember, all of these are section headers that should be in there. And then that in the next section will have a reproduction of your model. So like the stock and flow diagram, maybe annotated with causal links on top of it, and a description of your simulation methodology. And so exactly what were the motivation for why you chose these stocks, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of listed here. After that, you're going to get some results that'll come out of your graphs. The graphs that are generated by your simulation, they all go in this summary of results. It should not just be a list of figures. There should be figures in there, but you should have text around them that tells me what I'm looking at in those figures. But you shouldn't have any conclusions. You should just have a description of what is going on in those figures. Then in your conclusion, you've got a discussion of how those simulation results relate back to the original problem. And then you sort of propose your answer to the research question, or your solution to the problem that was given. So that's what's called outlined in this conclusion. So again, you can have references which say, those are maybe the websites you used to justify the parameters that you picked, for example. That's a good thing to do here, but make sure that these references are all cited within your report. And then if you need a little bit of extra space, so let's say you could show most of your simulation model that was necessary to make your argument in the main body, but there were extra kind of leaves of the simulation model that are for completeness really should be included, but they kind of distract from your main argument. Well, then maybe your full simulation model is shown in the appendix. But then that kind of subset or maybe sector view is shown in the main body of the report. Along with the report, also upload your Vincent model file or your Insight Maker file. If you did this in Insight Maker, under the share menu, you can go to export and download Insight Maker file to get that Insight Maker file to upload with your report. Then you also submit midweek your project presentation. This is going to be a video submission to Canvas. So you with your group will end up putting together a video. You might use slides, you might use the simulation software itself, you might use a combination of those, but you are going to upload your video submission and preferably also your slide material, if you've got slide material, along with your video presentation, right to Canvas. And this will be viewed on Canvas, as we'll see, by your peers who will end up doing a peer review. So remember that your target audience is not me. Your target audience is a stakeholder for the problem. So it could be a supervisor, your boss, a customer, a policymaker, the general public. It is someone who can be motivated to be interested in the problem, but doesn't already come into it pre-motivated for that. So you need to come into it and portray your project, why it's important, why they should be there, why they should be interested, and why they should be motivated by the results that you found. And it should be sort of a professional presentation. That doesn't mean I'm expecting you to be dressed up in suits and ties and things like that, but it should mean that you use complete sentences, the slides are clean, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and then the final thing that you're responsible for is doing a peer review of both a report and a presentation. And so these are the last two individual assignments here. So after everyone turns everything in midweek, then by the weekend of the last week of classes, before finals week, then each individual student will be given a randomly assigned report and a randomly assigned presentation, which might be from a different team, to do a peer review. There is a rubric for both of these online, and you'll use the rubric for both of these to evaluate each one, and then you'll leave a constructive set of comments on top of that. So you go through the rubric, you hit submit, that submits a score for you, and then the instructor will see all of those scores. And then on top of that, you'll have a box where you'll be able to put in a comment that needs to be a constructive comment about the report. And you will be graded on whether you left the peer review in the rubric, so the scores, as well as whether you left a constructive comment on their presentation. And if you do both of those, then you will receive the credit for the peer review. So this is 2% credit for the presentation peer review, 2% credit for the report peer review. Your reviews will be anonymized so that those receiving them won't know who they came from. But of course, you're going to see who you're reviewing. They'll be in the video and their names will be at the top of the report. Okay, so that is all that you're responsible for in doing this final project. And so if you have any questions, then let me know. This document is available online. There is more information that can be found and more detailed instructions on Canvas. So make sure to go to the final report module on Canvas to check out those more details and see if there's some samples that you can learn from. And otherwise, I hope you have a good time. I hope you, again, take an opportunity to have fun taking the modeling tools that you've learned this semester and applying them to a problem that is interesting to you, and maybe end up generating some results that you can take with you, maybe for other projects and other classes that you can build on or add to a portfolio, and so on and so forth. So enjoy it. If you have any questions, let us know, and just stay positive.